Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. See, we have people still coming in. Hopefully you should all see a poll showing up on the screen. Please answer these poll questions so we have a better idea of who is joining us today. We also do have the chat feature enabled today. Please let us know if you cannot see the poll questions or if you have any issues with hearing the audio or visuals. You can please let us know any of that in the chat as well. So again, we will get started our presentation in just a moment on grant administration, presented here by Whit O'Brien's. Just a moment once we have some poll questions answered. So again, I'd like to know where you're coming from, within the state or outside the state, what type of organization you belong to, if you've previously managed grant administration for the state and local fiscal recovery funds, or also how familiar you are with the direct and indirect costs for grant administration. So I see a number of people answering those poll questions. Thank you for that. And again, we will be getting started in just a moment. I'll give it just another minute for these poll questions. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is the third training that we are hosting with Whit O'Brien's. This is presented by the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. And it looks like we have a pretty good response. Maybe we can just give it another few seconds on the polls, and then we will share those answers in just a moment. And I think we're probably good on the polls now. Maybe we can share those results. Great. So thanks everyone for answering those polls. We see great diversity here. A lot of people from across different parts of the states. Good mix of representation. A lot of people here coming from county, local government, or nonprofits. Kind of split with more people not having previously done grant administration for the specific for the state and local fiscal recovery funds, and a mix of familiarity with designating direct and indirect costs, more people in the somewhat or not familiar range for that. So thank you so much for sharing your responses on those polls. And now we're going to get things started. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Amy Miller. I am the Federal Grant Administrator with the State Clearinghouse at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. And before we hear from our presenters from Whit O'Brien's, I'm going to share just a few slides on some resources that OPR has to help you with federal grants. You can find all this information on our website, opr.ca.gov. Under the tab for CEQA and federal grants, you'll go hover over the link for federal assistance. When you click that button, it will take you to our federal grants page here. And I'm going to highlight these three different topics very briefly. First, applying for federal grants, then federal grant resources, and closing out with our federal grant email list. So when you click that applying for federal grants link on our website, that will take you to our submission portal to comply with the Executive Order 12372 process, the intergovernmental review of federal programs. And thanks for that comment. I will be entering some links in the chat afterwards. So you can all go and find these resources directly. So here on this page, this is the Intergovernmental Review of Federal Programs page, again, complying with the executive order, which allows for federal grant applications to be reviewed by state and local officials. So this is where you'll go to submit your notice that you're applying for federal grants, and then that notice will go to the registered state and local officials, where they'll have the opportunity to review and comment on any application. Also, anyone from the public is able to view all of these notices here on this website through the submissions tab, which also allows filtering by area. Next, we have a whole lot of resources here on the Federal Grant Resources page, again, on the OPR website. This is helpful if you're just getting started out in federal grants, or if you're more familiar, there may be something here to help you out. And most importantly, this is where the slides and recordings from today's webinar will be posted under the heading for trainings. And then the last item I'm going to share is the federal grant email list, the federal grant update. This is a weekly newsletter sharing the latest in federal funding news, recently posted grant opportunities, as well as many training events, highlighting those that are free or low cost. This is a really great resource you won't find anywhere else. And so I will share the link for how to sign up directly for this in case you're not on it already. And so with that, I'd like to close. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, either about this webinar or other resources, or with the Executive Order 12372 process, anything like that, I'd be happy to assist you. And so with that, first, I have a quick disclaimer that the following presentation is not legal advice and is not necessarily representative of the views of OPR, but is provided here as a service to the grants community. And so with that, I am thrilled to turn things over to our presenters from Witt O'Brien's. We have Sarah, Tanya, and Dan to share some information. So I'll turn it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our discussion today on grant implementation and administrative indirect and direct costs. I recognize from the poll results and also the survey you answered when registering for today's presentation that there's varying levels of experience related to administrative, indirect, and direct costs. And also, while this presentation will focus on American Rescue Plan, state and local fiscal recovery funds, I also recognize there are a variety of different funding sources that you use, award types. And so our goal today is not to go into every single detail, but to give you a quality overview of key points and common scenarios, and then leave plenty of time at the end so we can have questions and some discussion as needed. And regarding questions, I want to let everyone know the chat is open and we'll be monitoring it throughout. If there's questions that we can answer directly there, we will do so. And again, at the end, I'll open up the floor for folks who want to use the raise hand function and ask questions that way as well. So with that said, what we will focus on in our presentation today are the following 4 items. So first of all, what are the administrative costs that are permitted under state and local fiscal recovery funds? I'm going to use the acronym SLFR moving forward. Second, what are direct costs, indirect costs, and the de minimis 10% of the total modified direct costs? The third question we'll be answering is, how can I categorize costs and know which cost bases to choose? And lastly, what are some key considerations for compliance? So before I jump into those items, I do want to introduce myself and our team. My name is Sarah Perry. My background is in policy analysis and organizational and project leadership, including recent support for COVID-19 grants management. I have my awesome colleagues, Tanya and Daniel, here with me today. Tanya brings extensive experience in subrecipient management, including accounting, claims review, housing services auditing, and program monitoring. Dan also has extensive experience in community development programs such as HUD, CDBG, ARPA, and other local grants management. So this includes monitoring federal programs and ensuring that programs can substantiate program costs and performance. And I just want to acknowledge it's an experienced team that understands there's a lot of nuance that can come with the allocation of administrative, direct, and indirect costs. So we'll do our best to answer your questions and give you some good information today. Next slide, please. So to start, I want to discuss our first question, what are the administrative costs that are permitted under SLFR? And following Treasury's final rule guidance, there are 3 types of eligible administrative expenses for this funding source. And I'll say first and foremost, recipients may use funds for administrative costs that are related to responding to the public health or negative economic impacts of the pandemic. Within that, the three eligible uses under that umbrella are things such as administrative costs that will improve the efficacy of such programs. And examples of that could be program evaluation, data analysis, or some targeted consumer outreach. The second eligible administrative expense use under SLIFR is for administrative costs associated with programs that are not SLIFR funded. So Treasury recognizes that there will be a variety of responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, some of which may be funded through other funding sources. However, in that case, administrative costs that respond to the pandemic are still eligible uses of SLIFR funds. And lastly, of course, administrative costs associated with programs that are funded through SLIFR are also an eligible use. As an additional eligible use of administrative funding, Treasury lets us know that the cost of consultants for project management, compliance monitoring, etc., is also an eligible use. And as a reminder, please refer to 2 CFR 200, the uniform guidance related to cost reasonability and allocable costs. Next slide, please. So some high-level pieces of information related to direct and indirect costs under SLIFR. So Treasury defines direct costs as the costs of implementing SLIFR program objectives. And this could include things like contract support, materials, and supplies for a project. Indirect costs are general costs of the organization where a portion of such costs may be allocated to the award. So things like cost of facilities, administrative functions, director's office. And it's very important to remember that each category of cost should be treated consistently as either direct or indirect. Additionally, recipients may not charge costs to both indirect and direct cost categories or to other programs. So once the determination of which category is made, it has to remain consistent, and costs cannot be charged under both direct and indirect. So if recipients already have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, also known as a NICRA, then the recipient may use that indirect cost rate. And in the event that a recipient does not have a NICRA, that recipient may elect to use the de minimis rate of 10%. And we will be discussing that further, calculating that and how to use it. Next slide, please. So regarding what are indirect costs, direct costs. Direct costs are an expense whose benefit can be specifically identified or assigned with a particular funding source or program. So an example of that is if an organization provides one service to the community, and that's funded by one grant award, then all expenses would benefit that one service, and they could be charged as direct costs. So we know a direct cost may be charged 100% to one program, or it may be charged to multiple programs. In the event that those direct costs or that direct cost will be charged to multiple programs, then the cost must be prorated based on how much time is dedicated to each program. If another program or another funding source is added, then it needs to be determined whether the costs are direct or indirect costs and how they'll be charged across the funding sources. And a last important reminder related to direct costs is that if something is funded as a direct cost, it must be subtracted from any indirect cost base to prevent any duplication of reimbursement. So if For example, facilities or rent is included in your indirect cost base. However, for a particular program, there's some facility expense that's being charged as direct. That would need to be removed from the indirect cost base so that it wasn't being reimbursed twice. Now, what are indirect costs? As I said earlier, these are costs that aren't necessarily associated with one program or one funding source. However, they are essential to the operation of the organization. Some typical indirect costs may be some percentage of the salary of the executive director or accounting staff, also audit services, facilities, etc. And so in some cases, or some organizations may choose to allocate indirect costs by an individual line item, for example, board expenses, audit services, or all of those indirect costs may be accumulated into one pool and charged as one single line item using the indirect cost rate. Now, organizations may have three options for how to charge indirect costs. As I mentioned, an organization may use a NICRA or their negotiated rate if they have one. If not, it's possible to use the de minimis 10% rate. And finally, there are some cases where an entity may negotiate a rate with a pass-through entity. So if you are the funding recipient and you have a subrecipient, that subrecipient may negotiate a rate with you. I do want to note that typically contractors are not permitted to seek reimbursement through indirect costs. So they may have overhead costs. However, because contractors provide or require a fee for service and provide a proposal response for that service, they include their overhead expenses in the fee that they negotiate with the pass-through entity. So again, typically contractors don't use an indirect cost rate, but their overhead expenses would be worked into the fee. Now, we're going to discuss de minimis 10%, and I just want to share why I think this in particular is important. So I often see recipients of funding or subrecipients that are presenting proposals using the de minimis 10% if they don't have a NICRA. And I think the calculation of how to do this can be a bit tricky. So I want to just give people a reminder, if you're submitting budgets, take a look at how you calculated the de minimis. And if you're reviewing budgets for funding that you're giving out, again, ensuring that this has been calculated correctly. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Tanya to discuss the de minimis 10% rate.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah stated, I'll be going over the de minimis 10% rate and also the correct calculation of the modified total direct costs. The 10% de minimis rate is for non-federal entities that have never received a negotiated indirect cost rate. No documentation is required to justify the use of the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate. So if you elect to use the de minimis, you would not have to provide documentation to support it. Okay, use of the de minimis 10% modified total direct costs. The rate may be used for all direct salaries and wages, applicable fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, travel, and up to the first $25,000 of each subaward. The MTDC excludes equipment, capital expenditures, and rental costs. Rates may be used indefinitely. There is no period of performance. Here's an example of the incorrect and correct way to calculate the modified total direct cost. The incorrect calculation would be just taking the amount of the award and applying 10%, which would be on $100 million award. The incorrect indirect cost would be $100,000. The correct way to calculate the award would be to take the amount of the award, subtract out any equipment. In this example, we use $25,000. We have 3 subawards. One is $100,000, one is $75,000, and one is $125,000. We will subtract all 3 of the subawards and the first $25,000 of each award, which would give you a modified total direct cost base of $750,000. You will apply the 10% de minimis to the $750,000, and the correct indirect cost would be $75,000. Next, we're going to go over categorizing costs. When another program and/or funding source is added, the best practice is to determine which costs are indirect, which are direct, as well as how to charge each of the programs and funding sources for expenses. Organizations are encouraged to charge costs directly as much as possible. However, there may be circumstances when costs are shared and must be allocated across more than one project. Shared costs may include office supplies, rent, audit, telephone, printing, and copying, utilities and salaries, as well as all the indirect costs for the organization. Having a fair and equitable allocation of costs is important for an accurate accounting of programs and/or funding source expenses. Here we're going to have an example of how to categorize costs. Let's assume you're an executive director of a small nonprofit organization that has recently received funding to add translation services for public health precautions. This funding is in addition to in-language services that you already provide. You dedicate a part-time staff person to translate documents and hire a consultant to teach personal safety classes. So the correct categorization of costs would be the direct costs would be the purchase of materials and supplies for the class. That would be 100% direct. You would also charge the salary and fringe and consulting fees for staff hired to only run the program. That would also be 100% direct costs. The indirect costs would be the organization's accountant, because she does not teach or provide in-language services, but yet she is necessary for the overall running of the corporation. You will also charge any insurance and any other fees that the organization could not operate without. The administrative costs include the allocation of the accountant's salary and fringe benefits, the program manager's salary and fringe benefits, office rent and utilities, corporate insurance, cell phones, and postage. The overhead costs would be shared operating direct costs considered overhead, such as rent, utilities, phone, and postage. These benefit all programs and could be allocated directly or included in an indirect cost pool. Other overhead costs include those associated with soliciting contributions and fundraising events. Please note, administrative costs can be direct or indirect. It is the responsibility of the awarded agency to carefully review their administrative costs and appropriately outline as direct or indirect. And I'll pass it to Dan.
Thank you, Tanya. With Tanya's last note in mind on the previous slide, what we'll look at here are a few line items for particular costs and their cost bases. Some of these line items include costs that could potentially go both in an indirect or a direct cost category, but as stated earlier, it's incumbent upon the awarding agency to bin these costs appropriately. Just as another example that we can walk through today, let's think about maybe including rent, for instance, as a direct cost. So just as an example here, as it says here, utilizing this kind of square footage basis, let's say, for instance, a nonprofit is seeking a direct reimbursement for a portion of their triple net lease. And the way that they can do that is maybe there are 5 case managers that are sharing a certain amount of square footage. And one of those case managers is 100% dedicated. Their time is 100% dedicated to the program in question. What the administering agency would have to do is develop a schedule of values to accurately bill that triple net lease, and then calculate the pro rata share for that employee and directly bill the program appropriately. That's just one example of taking kind of a rent, utilizing the cost basis of the square footage and applying it directly to a program. Next slide. So what you're looking at here are some cost-based guidelines. This is a summary of the section outlined at the bottom of the slide of 2 CFR 200, which is the factors affecting allowability of cost. In conclusion, this information is summarized from this factor. What we're trying to determine here is essentially the reasonability, necessity, allowability, and allocability of particular costs, and ways to support them when you're submitting your direct or indirect cost basis. Another part of this that's important is providing appropriate proof of charge, payment, and performance in order to substantiate these costs. I'll point you to bullet 3, for instance, which says the cost base must be appropriate to the cost. In this instance, the number of telephone instruments would not be an appropriate cost base to allocate fringe benefits, for instance. And I'll point you to the first bullet here. Cost must be reasonable and consistently applied without guessing or using budgeted amounts. So, for instance, the cost must be substantially by actual costs with supporting receipts and invoices. That's that proof of charge, proof of payment, and performance we were discussing. Next slide. So some common areas to review for compliance. These are kind of like low-hanging fruit for auditors, things that are going to be picked out to be reviewed. I won't detail, I'm not going to run through all of these, all the words, but let's say for salary costs, for instance, what's important to understand here is the timesheets, for instance, the basis for the salary costs should demonstrate the full time and effort of the individual's time that you're submitting to be reimbursed. So what do I mean by that? Just because 50% of an individual's time is spent on the project in question, the time and effort submitted on that timesheet should represent 100% of their total time and effort for the period being billed. And for expenses, this is that proof of charge, proof of payment, proof of performance piece. If an organization is going to charge a funding source for costs, those costs must be documented to show how the activity was related to the program, but also document its nexus to the program scope of work and eligibility. I'll hammer it home again, proof of charge, proof of payment, proof of performance. Do you have the invoice that shows that you received the charge? Canceled check to demonstrate payment, and then performance, some way to demonstrate that the good or service was received. Unallowable costs in this instance, since we're discussing direct and indirect costs, I'll point you to the italicized example that's in here in bullet 3, which is essentially stating, let's say you have an indirect cost and you come to find that one of the costs that were in that indirect pool are now unallowable. What you need to do is go back and you have to remove that cost from your indirect cost pool that has already been invoiced, and then in subsequent invoices as well. And then finally, this one I will read word for word for returns and refunds. If a refund is received for an overpayment of an expense and the expense was originally expended at least or in part from a federal grant, the federal government expects that it will receive its fair share of that refund. And we can go to the next slide. I will some of the higher points. I just want to touch on some of the things. This is essentially a summary of, what we had discussed in most of these sections, but some of the previous ones, things that we've all echoed, all three of us, include treating each category of cost consistently, not charging a cost as both direct and indirect to avoid that duplication of costs. Be familiar and know how to categorize your costs. And also make sure that it is a fair and equitable allocation of costs for an accurate accounting of program and or funding source expense. Essentially, these are items that an organization must consider during the budget and development process when responding to various federal grant applications. It is important to be as detailed as possible during the budgeting phase so that these questions revolving around indirect and direct costs do not arise during the invoicing time of review. Thank you. Go to the next slide.
All right, so as I said, I know that's a overview, and so of course we want to provide folks with some references as well. I'm sure folks here that are working with ARPA funding are very familiar with this, but I'm going to put in the chat the link to Treasury's compliance and reporting guidance, which does touch on everything we've discussed here today in terms of indirect and direct costs and administrative costs under SLIFR. So feel free to take a look at that. We've also compiled links to various references we've made today related to the uniform guidance. So we have links related to direct and indirect costs, internal controls regulations, cost principles, audit requirements, and subrecipient monitoring and management, including record retention requirements. At the bottom of the slide too, we also have a link to just some general considerations related to 2 CFR 200. I saw in the chat someone asked if we will share the slides, and yes, they will be uploaded for all attendees to be able to access. And so with that, I want to move us into our questions portion. And I see it was answered here, but I know it still could be nuanced. So I just wanted to start by recognizing the question that said, can you explain the difference between administrative and overhead? And Tanya responded to say, administrative costs are incurred to support the function of a business, and overhead are what it costs to run the business. But I did just want to acknowledge that, see if anybody had follow-up questions related, or Tanya, if you wanted to say any further clarification related to that.
I could maybe give an example. Administrative could be like executive salaries, supplies, and overhead would be more like your insurance, utilities, things like that.
Any further clarification from folks in, so I see we have a follow-up question that says, can the executive pay be both?
It's more administrative, but the two really do kind of go hand in hand. So, you know, a lot of companies just look at administrative as overhead, but it could, I guess, technically it could, but it's really more administrative than overhead.
Thanks, Tanya. Okay, so another follow-up here that said the slide shows that insurance is administrative. But Tanya also just mentioned it was overhead. Any clarification you can provide on that?
Yeah, as I say, they administrative and overhead really kind of go hand in hand. I don't know. I didn't realize the slide said it was administrative, but it's mostly overhead because it's more to the what's a protection of the business.
Thanks, Tanya. I did also want to revisit another question we had in the chat because I think it is important for a lot of different aspects of these ARPA awards, and it was the question is, can you report administrative costs under a project expenditure category, or do you have to create a new project under an admin cost expenditure category? And I'm sure folks that are dealing with ARPA funds have been doing reports and have a system to how they've been doing this. I know in my experience with some clients, there have been ongoing conversations though, and even revisiting that conversation. So I just wanted to share our response, which was under ARPA, either strategy may work, and it depends on what the expense is. So if you've decided that a particular admin cost is dedicated to one program under one expenditure category, and that's the project in the report, then certainly that admin expense can be reported under that project and expenditure category. However, you may have instances where, let's say you have a bucket of administrative expenses that are related to all behavioral health programs that under ARPA. In that case, you may use the 7.1 or the 3.5 expenditure category and create an entirely separate project in your report. And I just wanted to see any follow-up questions related to that from the person that had asked in the chat. It was Adam. Okay, great. Said no. Okay, I see we have another chat question here. Do we have any guidance on how to request a NICRA for a nonprofit organization? So Dan or Tanya, do you want to jump in related to that?
Sorry, Sarah. Yeah, I think I would rather take some more time if that's okay for the individual that posed that one. I believe all cognizant agencies, so like Health and Human Services, things like that, they all, I think there's a difference of approach there for the NICRAs. Tanya, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that needs a little bit more of a nuanced look before we answer here.
I could just advise that you would submit your plan to your cosmic agency. I'm not really sure if that's what you're asking. The agency that you receive the most funding from.
Benedicta, do you care to clarify or want to elaborate on your question?
Hi, thank you so much for the time and for this informational session. I was just wondering, yeah, what essentially would be the first few steps to do that? And I think Tanya kind of answered that by saying to work with the agency that gives us the most money.
Great. Yeah, I think that's right. Would be the correct first step. Thank you.
Thank you.
If folks have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if anyone wants to use the hand raise function and jump in. I'll jump in with my own question. I reviewed some questions that people submitted ahead of time. So something I wanted to address, if it didn't come up, was kind of two parts: what is allowed under administrative costs, and are there caps? And we've discussed what's allowable under SLIFR, but related to the portion on whether or not there are administrative cost caps, the answer to that is it depends on the funding source. So under ARPA, no. However, you may find with HUD or other funding sources that yes, there are caps on the allowable amount of administrative costs. Okay, I'm just catching up on some chats that came through. So next question is, do we apply to the state or to the federal government? And I believe that is related to obtaining a NICRA, in which case, Dan or Tanya, correct me or jump in here, but you would apply to the federal agency from which you received the most funding. Yeah. Dan in the chat, federal cognizant agency.
We have a hand raised as well if you want to take that question, I believe.
Yeah.
Yep. Hello, can everyone hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, great. Hi, my name's Maniza. I'm a grants manager for a nonprofit in Los Angeles, and I have a question about laptops. I've heard that laptops purchased with federal funds can raise red flags when it comes to administrative costs. Do you have any input on that or any advice?
I'm gonna kick it to Dan.
Yeah, let me find there's a whole section of 2 CFR 200 with regards to equipment and like disposition plans associated with said equipment.
Okay.
Where what you want to do is have a disposition plan for the equipment and say what you're going to do with it during the program and after the program's life cycle. You can utilize that equipment even after the program ends.
Right.
But you have to use it for similar use or a similar type of program. There's a $5,000 threshold. It's kind of this, I don't want to call it it's not a golden number, but it's the one that sits in my head. And there's a $5,000 threshold for when those disposition plans are required. So in the event that you have a piece of equipment or a batch of equipment that is above that $5,000 threshold, you definitely want to have a disposition plan ready and submitted to your federal agency for approval.
Okay, so do we have to wait for them to request it? And is disposition the same thing as a strong justification?
That is something I think a disposition plan, I don't know if we have templates on that, but I can look and see.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's one thing to say like, yes, we need these absolutely in order for the program to perform the scope of service laid out in our project, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I believe there's kind of not a specific template, but a way to lay it out so that you're like, it's kind of like an inventory of that expense.
Right.
And then your intended like use over the lifetime of that particular product, not just we need it for this particular scope of service type.
Okay, so we don't have to wait for them to ask us, why did you buy these? But we simply have to provide a justification initially.
Yeah,
I think that's what I'm asking.
This goes back to I'll refer to whatever agency you're working with on that as well.
Okay.
But I will say something that we've echoed, right, in this presentation is be as specific as possible during that budgeting phase so
Mhm.
that people know, like, as a part of your response, our scope of service is going to include XYZ. To do that, we include this particular type of equipment that we're purchasing, and then have a plan associated with that equipment.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it.
Yep.
I wanted to follow up on a question in the chat here too, related to the de minimis rate. And I'm wondering, Kayla, if it would be possible to go back to slide 18 so we can look at the calculation. I think it's just a little easier to follow when we have the numbers. Great. So the question is just if we can explain a bit more about the total award section and what we mean by the sub awards. And Tanya responded to say sub awards are contracts. And so just to put an example to this, if you are the recipient of federal funds and you put out an RFP or a funding opportunity and then have subrecipients or sub awards where you're passing that money through to another entity, that is the example, in which case you can include up to $25,000, or you can include $25,000 of that sub award in the de minimis rate calculation. But so let's say you give $100,000 or $500,000 to a nonprofit to run a food program. Only $25,000 of that sub award could be included in your calculation for the modified total direct cost. And I see a follow-up question which says, what paperwork are required to use the de minimis rate? And I would say the budget. So that is the primary piece of paperwork. I would also say if you have a NICRA, you use the NICRA, not the de minimis rate. I don't believe there's any other associated paperwork. It's just having the budget and being able to substantiate the calculation. Tanya, anything that I'm missing for that?
No, there's no, and if you're asking if there's any backup documentation required, there's no documentation required.
And then, okay, is there an application to submit? No, so if you're using the de minimis rate, there's no application. I mean, there's an opportunity to use that in place of a NICRA if you don't have a NICRA. And same, that's if you're using the de minimis rate. Now, if you're a recipient and you're looking at subawards, subrecipients, for example, then there's no application for your sub-awardee either. However, it would be you as the primary recipient of the funding's responsibility to, again, review the budget, ensure the calculation is correct, but there's no formal application to use the de minimis rate. I want to offer folks the opportunity to raise their hand or come off mic in case there's any additional clarification for what we've discussed or any new questions.
Yeah, I think we can probably end a little early if there's no further questions. And if anything does come up afterwards, please feel free to reach out through us to us for any follow-up questions. And so I think we'll end it a little bit early today. So we do want to share a little bit more information about what you'll be receiving next. You will get a post-training survey that will go out via email. So please do take that so we can make sure that you had a good experience today. And if you have any ideas for future webinars, we'd like to hear those as well. We'll also be sharing a resource guide memo about those direct and indirect costs as well. And then we also hope that you'll join us next week for our final of these 4 trainings that we've been doing through the month of March with Wood O'Brien's. So next week is also on the American Rescue Plan Act, the Compliance Supplement Addendum for that. So again, please check your emails for that. And we want to thank everyone for joining us today. So thanks for joining. Bye.